The Tunisia Campaign was a series of battles that took place in Tunisia during the North African Campaign of the Second World War, between Axis and Allied forces. The Allies consisted of British Imperial forces, including Polish and Greek contingents, with American and French corps. The battle opened with initial success by the German and Italian forces, but the massive supply and numerical superiority of the Allies led to the decisive defeat of the Axis. Over 230,000 German and Italian troops were taken as prisoners of war, including most of the Afrika Korps. Background: Western Desert. The first 2 years of the war in North Africa were characterized by chronic supply shortages and transport problems. The North African coast has few natural harbors, and the British base at Alexandria on the Nile Delta was some 2,100 kilometers by road from the main Italian port at Tripoli in Libya. Smaller ports at Benghazi and Tobruk were 1,050 kilometers and 640 kilometers west of Alexandria on the Littorania Balbo, running along a narrow corridor along the coast. Control of the central Mediterranean was contested by the British and Italian navies, which were equally matched and exerted a reciprocal constraint supply through Alexandria, Tripoli, Benghazi and Tobruk. Although the British could supply Egypt via the long route through the Atlantic around the Cape of Good Hope and by the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea, the chronic difficulty in the supply of military forces in the desert led to several indecisive victories by both sides and long fruitless advances along the coast. The Italian invasion of Egypt by the 10th Army in 1940 advanced 97 kilometers into Egypt and more than 1,600 kilometers in a straight line from Tripoli, 600 kilometers from Benghazi and 320 kilometers from Tobruk. The Western Desert Force fought a delaying action as it fell back to Massaw Matruh. Then began Operation Compass, a raiding counter-attack into Libya. The 10th Army was destroyed and the WDF occupied El Agheila, some 970 kilometers from Alexandria. With the arrival of the German Afrika Korps, the Axis counter-attacked in Operation Sonnenblume and in April 1941 reached the limit of their supply capacity at the Egyptian border but failed to recapture Tobruk. In November 1941 the 8th Army recovered, helped by the short supply distance from Alexandria to the front line, and launched Operation Crusader, relieving the siege of Tobruk, and again reached El Agheila. The 8th Army was soon pushed back to Gazala west of Tobruk, and at the Battle of Gazala in May 1942, the Axis pushed them all the way back to El Alamein, only 160 kilometers from Alexandria. In 1942, the Royal Navy and Italian Navy were still disputing the Mediterranean, but the British hold on Malta allowed the Royal Air Force to sink more Italian supply ships. Large quantities of supplies became available to the British from the United States, and the supply situation of the 8th Army eventually becoming overwhelming. With 8th Army no longer constrained, the Axis were driven westwards from Egypt following the Second Battle of El Alamein in November 1942. Operation Torch. In July 1942, the Allies agreed that proposed relatively small-scale amphibious operations to land in northern France during 1942. Operation Sledgehammer, which was the forerunner of Operation Roundup, the main landings in 1943, were impractical and should be deferred. Instead, it was agreed that landings would be made to secure the Vichy territories in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, and then to thrust east to take the Axis forces in the Western Desert in their rear. An Allied occupation of the whole of the North African coast would open the Mediterranean to Allied shipping, thus releasing the huge capacity required to maintain supplies round the circuitous route via the Cape of Good Hope. On the 8th of November, Operation Torch landed Allied forces in Algeria and Morocco with the intention that once Vichy forces in Algeria had capitulated, an advance would be made to Tunis, some 800 kilometers to the east. Prelude. Allied plans. Because of the nearness of Sicily to Tunisia, The Allies expected that the Axis would move to occupy the country as soon as they heard of the torch landings. In order to forestall this, it would be necessary to occupy Tunisia as quickly as possible after the landings were made. However, there was a limit to how far east the torch landings could be made because of the increasing proximity of Axis airfields in Sicily and Sardinia, which, at the end of October, held 298 German and 574 Italian aircraft. Algiers was accordingly chosen for the most easterly landings. This would ensure the success of the initial landings in spite of uncertainty as to how the incumbent French forces would react. Once Algiers was secured, a small force, the Eastern Task Force, would be projected as quickly as possible into Tunisia in a race to occupy Tunis, some 800 kilometers distant along poor roads in difficult terrain during the winter rainy season, before the Axis could organize. However, planners had to assume the worst case regarding the extent of Vichy opposition at Algiers, and the invasion convoys were assault-loaded with a preponderance of infantry to meet heavy ground opposition. This meant that at Algiers the disembarkation of mobile forces for an advance to Tunisia would necessarily be delayed. Plans were thus a compromise, and the Allies realized that an attempt to reach Bizerte and Tunis overland before the Axis could establish themselves represented a gamble which depended on the ability of the Navy and Air Force to delay the Axis build-up. The Allies, although they had provided for the possibility of strong Vichy opposition to their landings both in terms of infantry and Air Force allocations, seriously underestimated the Axis appetite for and speed of intervention in Tunisia. Once operations had commenced, and despite clear intelligence reports regarding the Axis reaction, the Allies were slow to respond, and it was not until nearly 2 weeks after the landings that air and naval plans were made to interdict Axis sea transport to Tunis. At the end of November, Naval Force K was reformed in Malta with 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers, and Force Q formed in Bonn with 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers. No Axis ships sailing to Tunis were sunk in November, but the Allied naval forces had some success in early December, sinking 7 Axis transports. However, this came too late to affect the fighting on land because the armored elements of 10th Panzer Division had already arrived. To counter the surface threat, Axis convoys were switched to daylight when they could be protected by air cover. Night convoys resumed on completion of the extension of Axis minefields, which severely restricted the activities of Force K and Force Q. Tunisia is rectangular, with its northern and much of its eastern boundary on the Mediterranean coast. Most of the inland western border with Algeria is astride the western line of the Atlas Mountains, which run from the Atlantic coast of Morocco, 1,900 kilometers east to Tunis. This portion of the border is easily defensible with a small number of passes through the 2 north-south lines of the mountains. In the south, a second line of lower mountains limit the approaches to a narrow gap, facing Libya to the east, between the Matmata Hills and the coast. The French had earlier constructed a 20 km wide and 30 km deep series of defensive works known as the Marath Line along the plain, to defend against an Italian invasion from Libya. Only in the north was the terrain favorable to attack. Here the Atlas Mountains stopped near the eastern coast, leaving a large area on the northwest coast unprotected. Defensive lines in the north could deal with approaching forces, while the Marath Line made the south secure. In between, there were only a few easily defended passes through the Atlas Mountains. Tunisia has 2 big deep water ports at Tunis and Bizerte, only a few hundred miles from Italian supply bases in Sicily. Ships could deliver supplies at night, safe from RAF patrols, and return the next night, while Libya was a full-day trip, making supply operations vulnerable to daylight air attacks. In Hitler's view, Tunisia could be held indefinitely, upsetting Allied plans in Europe. run for Tunis. By the 10th of November, French opposition to the torch landings had ceased, creating a military vacuum in Tunisia. Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, commanding British First Army, immediately ordered the 36th Infantry Brigade Group, which had been the floating reserve for the Algiers landing, eastward by sea to occupy the Algerian ports of Bougie, Philippeville and Bone and the airfield at Djedjeli, preliminary to advancing into Tunisia. The combined chiefs of staff had decided that with the forces available, torch would not include assault landings close to Tunisia. Anderson needed to get his limited force east quickly, before the Axis could reinforce Tunisia, but the Allies had only 2 brigade groups and some additional armor and artillery for the attack. The French governor in Tunisia, Admiral Esteve, was afraid to support the Allies or oppose the Axis. He did not close airfields to either side and the Germans moved first, and by the 9th of November, there were reports of 40 German aircraft arriving at Tunis, and by the 10th of November, aerial reconnaissance reported 100 aircraft. 2 days later, an airlift began that carried over 15,000 men and 581 long tons of supplies, and ships brought 176 tanks, 131 artillery pieces, 1,152 vehicles, and 13,000 long tons of supplies. By the end of the month, 3 German divisions, including the 10th Panzer Division, and 2 Italian infantry divisions had arrived. Walther Nering was assigned command of the newly formed 90th Corps on the 12th of November and flew in on the 17th of November. The French military commander in Tunisia, General Barré, moved troops into the western mountains of Tunisia and formed a defensive line from Tebessok through Majaz al-Bab. There were 2 roads eastwards into Tunisia from Algeria. The Allied plan was to advance along the 2 roads and take Bizerte and Tunis. On the 11th of November, the British 36th Infantry Brigade had landed unopposed at Bougie, but supply shortages delayed their arrival at Djedjeli until the 13th of November. Bone Airfield was occupied following a parachute drop by 3rd Parachute Battalion, and this was followed on the 12th of November by 6th Commando seizing the port. Advanced guards of the 36th Infantry Brigade reached Tabarka on the 15th of November and Djedjeli on the 18th of November, where they met Axis forces. Further south, on the 15th of November, a U.S. Parachute Battalion made an unopposed drop at Aix-les-Bains, capturing the airfield, and advanced to take the airfield at Gafsa on the 17th of November. On the 19th of November, the German commander, Walther Nering, demanded passage for his forces across the bridge at Medjez and was refused by Barré. The Germans attacked twice and were repulsed, but the French defensive success was costly and, lacking armor and artillery, were obliged to withdraw. Despite some Vichy French forces, such as Barré's siding against the Axis, the position of Vichy forces remained uncertain until on the 22nd of November. The North African Agreement placed French North Africa on the Allied side, allowing the Allied garrison troops to be sent forward to the front. By this time, the Axis had been able to build up a corps, and outnumbered the Allies in almost all ways. Battle. 2 Allied brigade groups advanced toward Djedjeli and Behar respectively. The Luftwaffe, happy to have local air superiority while the Allies' planes had to fly from relatively distant bases in Algeria, harassed them all the way. On the 17th of November, the same day Nering arrived, the leading elements of the British 36th Brigade on the Northern Road met a mixed force of 17 tanks and 400 paratroops with self-propelled guns at Djedjeli. The German paratroopers, Luftwaffe and Italian fire support from the 1st Mountain Infantry Division Superga knocked out 11 tanks, but their advance was halted while the fight at Djedjeli continued for 9 days. On the 22nd of November, tanks from the Italian 50th Brigade forced U.S. paratroopers to abandon Gafsa. The two Allied columns concentrated at Djebel Abiod and Behar, preparing for an assault on the 24th of November. The 36th Brigade was to advance from Djebel Abiod toward Matur, and 11th Brigade was to move down the valley of the river Murjada to take Majaz al-Bab and then to Taborba, Jeddah and Tunis. Blade Force, an armored regimental group, was to strike across country on minor roads in the gap between the two infantry brigades towards CDNSIR and make flanking attacks on Taborba and Jeddah. The northern attack did not take place because torrential rain had slowed the build-up. In the south, the 11th Brigade were halted by stiff resistance at Medjez. Blade Force passed through CDNSIR to reach the Chawagua Pass. North of Taborba, part of Blade Force infiltrated behind Axis lines to the newly activated airbase at Jeddah in the afternoon and destroyed more than 20 Axis planes, but lacking infantry support, withdrew to Chawagua. Blade Force's attack caught Nering by surprise and he decided to withdraw from Medjez and strengthen Jeddah, only 30 kilometers from Tunis. The 36th Brigade's delayed attack began on the 26th of November, but they were ambushed, with the leading battalion taking 149 casualties. Further attacks were driven back from cleverly planned interlocking defenses. A supporting landing by one commando 23 km west of Bizerte on the 30th of November in an attempt to outflank the Jifna position failed, and the unit had rejoined 36th Brigade by the 3rd of December. The position remained in German hands until the last days of fighting in Tunisia the following spring. Early on the 26th of November, as the Germans withdrew, 11th Brigade were able to enter Medjez unopposed and by late in the day had taken positions in and around Taborba, which had also been evacuated by the Germans, preparatory to advancing on Jeddah. However, on the 27th of November the Germans attacked in strength an 11th Brigade's attempt to regain the initiative in the early hours of the 28th of November, attacking toward Jeddah airfield with the help of U.S. armor failed. On the 29th of November, Combat Command B of U.S. 1st Armored Division had concentrated forward for an attack in conjunction with Blade Force planned for the 2nd of December. They were forestalled by an Axis counterattack, led by Major General Wolfgang Fischer, whose 10th Panzer Division had just arrived in Tunisia. By the evening of the 2nd of December, Blade Force had been withdrawn, leaving 11th Brigade and Combat Command B to deal with the Axis attack. This threatened to cut off 11th Brigade and break through into the Allied rear, but desperate fighting over 4 days delayed the Axis advance and permitted a controlled withdrawal to the high ground on each side of the river west of Taborba. The Allied force initially withdrew roughly 9.7 kilometers to the high positions of Longstop Hill and Boaoukas on each side of the river, but concern over the vulnerability to flanking attacks prompted a further withdrawal west, so that by the end of the 10th of December, Allied units held a defensive line just east of Medjez el-Bab. Here, they started a build-up for another attack, and were ready by late December 1942. The slow build-up had brought Allied force levels up to a total of 54,000 British, 73,800 American, and 7,000 French troops. A hasty intelligence review showed about 125,000 combat and 70,000 service troops, mostly Italian, in front of them. The main attack began the afternoon of the 22nd of December. Despite rain and insufficient air cover, progress was made up the lower ridges of the 900-foot Longstop Hill that controlled the river corridor from Medjez to Taborba and thence to Tunis. After 3 days of to-and-fro fighting, with ammunition running low and Axis forces now holding adjacent high ground, the Longstop position became untenable, and the Allies were forced to withdraw to Medjez. and by the 26th of December 1942 the Allies had withdrawn to the line they had set out from 2 weeks earlier, having suffered 20,743 casualties. Aftermath French politics. While the battles wound down, factionalism among the French again erupted. On the 24th of December, François Darlan was assassinated and Henry Giraud succeeded him as High Commissioner. To the frustration of the Free French, the U.S. government had displayed considerable willingness to make a deal with Darlan and the Vichists. Consequently, Darlan's death appeared to present an opportunity to bring together the French in North Africa and Charles de Gaulle's Free French. De Gaulle and Giraud met in late January, but little progress was made in reconciling their differences or the constituencies they represented. It was not until June 1943 that the French Committee of National Liberation was formed under the joint chairmanship of Giraud and de Gaulle. When de Gaulle quickly eclipsed Giraud, who openly disliked political responsibility and more or less willingly from then on deferred to the leader of the Free French. Command changes. Nering, considered by most to be an excellent commander, had continually infuriated his superiors with outspoken critiques and was replaced when the command was renamed the 5th Panzer Army. Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim arrived in Tunis unannounced on 8 December, to assume command. The army consisted of the Composite Infantry Division von Broich, von Manteufel in the Bizerte area, the 10th Panzer Division in the centre before Tunis, and the 1st Mountain Infantry Division Superga on the southern flank. But Hitler had told Arnim that the army would grow to 3 mechanized and 3 motorized divisions. The Allies had tried to prevent the Axis build-up with substantial air and sea forces, but Tunis and Bizerte were only 190 kilometers from the ports and airfields of western Sicily, 290 kilometers from Palermo and 480 kilometers from Naples, making it very difficult to intercept Axis transports which had the benefit of substantial air cover. From mid-November 1942 to January 1943, 243,000 men and 856,000 long tons of supplies and equipment arrived in Tunisia by sea and air. Eisenhower transferred further units from Morocco and Algeria eastward into Tunisia. In the north, the First Army over the next 3 months received 3 more British divisions: 1st Infantry Division, 4th Infantry Division and 46th Infantry Division, joining the 6th Armoured Division and 78th Infantry Division. By late March the British 9th Corps HQ had arrived to join 5th Corps in controlling the expanded army. On their right flank, the basis of a 2-division French 19th Corps was assembling. In the south was the U.S. 2nd Corps, consisting of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, 34th Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division. Giraud refused to have the French Corps under the command of the 1st Army in it, and the U.S. 2nd Corps remained under command of AFHQ. New forward airfields were built to improve air support. The U.S. also began bases in Algeria and Tunisia, to form a large forward base at Maknessi, on the eastern edge of the Atlas Mountains, well placed to cut off the Panzer Army in the south from Tunis and the 5th Panzer Army in the north.